Under no circumstances, for no reason whatsoever, should you ever even think about carrying a pair of scissors with you on the Sabbath. At one time, among faithful folk, that was actually a rule, a restriction that was written down. And the more that I think about it, I get it. I mean, you start carrying scissors around with you, and spontaneous scrapbooking could happen just like that. And I think we all know that if we start scrapbooking, glitter isn't far behind. And while I didn't read it, I'm pretty sure that glitter is on the no sir list of Sabbath restrictions. One author I read said that there are 39 categories of things that are restricted on the Sabbath day. And it includes this long laundry list of things. Things like, don't do the laundry, no cooking, no going and turning on a light when you enter a room. You weren't to drive on the Sabbath. You see, you all had a built-in excuse not to come today, and you missed the moment. Sorry. There's a restriction that you shouldn't write a poem or a sonnet on the Sabbath, so there goes my afternoon plans. And also there was a restriction that you should not play a musical instrument on the Sabbath, so we'll be singing the last hymn a cappella this morning. All of these restrictions, behind and beneath them, underneath them, was really just one simple truth. Don't create. And even deeper than that was really this understanding for us as human beings not to interfere with creation on the Sabbath, but to try to interact with it on its own terms, for its own sake. But what can happen is so often in religious circles, we get so wrapped up in what's in bounds or what's out of bounds. We get so wrapped up in talking about the right way to do something that we wear this rut. A rut that we think is the only path. When really there are so many paths we could take in trying to embrace and live the Sabbath in these days. You see, over the last 3 weeks, I think that actually you could cook this afternoon if you'd like and still honor the Sabbath, especially when you're enjoying that meal if you slow down. Savor the taste on the tips of your tongue. I think you can do yard work on the Sabbath, especially if you listen to the song the trees are singing or feel the grass growing beneath your feet. I think we can play musical instruments on the Sabbath, especially if we sing in such a way that affirms and acknowledges God's song, tries to join in with God's singing in the midst of these days. But as for that restriction around scissors, I think we're going to have counsel talk about that. There could be something to that restriction for us today. Today we hear these two stories about Jesus' interaction and encounter with the Sabbath, how he's trying to get people to broaden the religious rut they found themselves in. And the two stories have some very similar plot points to them. The first story starts off with Jesus and the disciples going for a stroll on the Sabbath. And apparently the disciples didn't realize how long this hike was going to be. Otherwise, they would have packed a lunch for the event. But as they're walking along, their stomachs start to grumble and rumble. There's a hunger deep within them. And there's no 7-Eleven they could stop into and purchase a Snickers bar. But as they're walking and that hunger keeps growing within them, off in the distance, they see some wheat that's waving in the wind, calling out to them saying, "I'm delicious." As they get closer, they pluck some of the heads of the wheat, pop them into their mouths, savoring that raw wheat grass. I think we all know how hungry they must have been now. But this scene is absolutely absurd and even hilarious in the fact when you consider what happens afterwards. Here are the Pharisees who pop out of nowhere. I mean, reread that story. Either A, they were sort of crouching down somewhere trying to hide among the wheat stalks like you did as a child playing hide and seek. I mean, maybe you can even hear them whispering, "Look, here come the disciples. They're totally going to eat some of the wheat." Or B, they were trying to conceal themselves, standing upright, hiding behind a stalk of wheat, saying to each other, "You don't think they can see us, do you?" However this unfolds, they hop out of hiding and say to the disciples, "We caught you." But I start to wonder, is it really about the wheat? Or maybe is it about this new uppity rabbi named Jesus who was pushing all of the Pharisees' buttons? I ask that because there are moments I can see myself in that. I'm not trying to criticize the Pharisees here. There are moments I get caught up in that. There are moments that my response, my reaction to someone who's pushing my buttons is less than loving. There are times I can find myself making snide remarks drenched with sarcasm. There are some times I say something online or in an email I immediately regret. Those moments when maybe we point out someone else's mistake or misstep, not for their sake, but to puff up ourselves. There are moments sometimes we say something not to help, but because we want to remind ourselves that we are on the right path and they need to follow us. The more I let this first story in Mark's gospel sink and settle in, the more I realize I'm both. I'm both the disciple. I come this morning with deep hungers, and I'm also like the Pharisee. I want things done my way because I think it's the right way to do things. Both. The second story is an echo of the first. The setting has changed a bit. It's no longer a grain field. It's a synagogue. It's no longer the disciples that are ailing. It's a stranger. It's somebody Jesus didn't even know who had a withered hand. And it's no longer just this sense of brokenness, but it's also taken place in a more public setting. But several of the other plot points are exactly the same. Jesus asked the man with the ailment to stand up. And I wonder if that wasn't so much to make a spectacle out of him or put a spotlight on him. I wonder if maybe Jesus asked him to stand up because he wanted to give the Pharisees an opportunity to see this person as the beloved child of God for which he is and was. Jesus heals the man. The Pharisees continue to fume with frustration. Jesus keeps on pushing those boundaries of the religious rut that people could find themselves in. If you take both stories together, I think both stories remind us that at the center point of the Sabbath was made for life. We heard that in the passage today. The Sabbath is made for life. But it's not just joy. that's a part of that. Part of the life is also for us to acknowledge. We have to sometimes name and notice the pain we have physically, the pain you and I can carry emotionally, the pain we have spiritually, the pain we sometimes have relationally with one another. The Sabbath toward life offers us not a narrow rut, but should offer us a spacious dwelling place where we can begin to process some of our pain, just some of it, so that we don't pass it along to others. The Sabbath not as a narrow rut that we just march into, but a spacious place we enter into God's presence, where we can pause. Some of you were here last week when I taught you that American Sign Language for pause, where you take your right index finger, point it down, left index finger, point off to the side, and then gently reach down, hook your left, and pull up gently. I heard from some of you practiced this last week, sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, right? That pause, that sacred speed bump, Sabbath moments scattered throughout our lives. To pause. Reminds me of a great quote by the theologian Anne Lamott. She writes that almost everything will work better if you occasionally unplug it, especially you. Those moments, those sacred speed bumps we need. And so as we're wrapping up the series on the Sabbath, there are several truths that I hold and that I want to continue to carry with me, not only throughout the month of September, but throughout this year and into next year as well. That sense that Sabbath is toward life, but it's toward life with a bias towards feeding and healing for ourselves, for others, for the sake of the world God so loves. These sacred Sabbath speed bump moments. And as we've dwelled in this series, we've reminded ourselves it isn't just about this hour. Sabbath can't be narrowly confined and defined to just this time. Sabbath, sacred speed bumps for life with a bias towards healing and feeding, can be scattered throughout every single day of the unfolding week. Sabbath is for life. But I also hold on to the truth that you can't force someone to rest. We can't mandate or legislate or regulate someone to take that pause. Trying to tell or force somebody to rest, I think that makes as much sense as when the engine in your car breaks down to repaint the bumper. It just doesn't match up. But in a world that constantly is connected, that's constantly telling us to go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, in a world that wants us to be in perpetual motion all the time, we as people of faith say there's another way. This sacred pause that's scattered this morning and throughout other mornings in this week to come. Third, we notice and name that when we take those pauses, there's going to be some uneasiness within us. You might hear that voice in your back of your mind saying, you don't deserve this, you didn't earn this. Other voices around you might say, don't just sit there, do something, right? That resistance around us and within us. But we know that part of the rhythm is that we both work and then we cease from working. We both create and then we pause and let the creation be and breathe. To keep practicing that kind of Sabbath speed bump rhythm in our lives in these days. And then finally, I carry with me that invitation of the Sabbath spaces when we practice it here and when we practice it individually, uniquely in each of our lives, that it's toward healing, that it's toward feeding us as we move to the table this morning, this communion table where everyone is welcome. We bring with us those hungers we have to taste the bread on the tip of our tongue. We bring with us the places and spaces and people in our lives that long for healing, the hardness of maybe our own hearts sometimes. We bring all of that to the table that we might encounter God's presence here. Sabbath for life, a Sabbath rhythm where we both work and we stop, where we both pour ourselves into projects and into people we care about, and then we let that loose into the world for its own sake, where we both sit to dream about big projects and what might happen and just be creative with God. And then we pick up the scissors of life to create with God with reckless abandon. May our Sabbath sake and sense of life continue to evolve in the coming days and weeks with a blessing and a reminder of God's presence. Amen.